Good day. Today is Wednesday, 20th August 2025, and I think it's fair to say that since the hours since the Washington meetings between President Trump of the United States and President Zelinski of Ukraine and President Trump and the various European leaders, there's been a dawning realization starting to take hold across Europe that the meetings in Washington have achieved nothing, and that in fact nothing of any substance ultimately was agreed over the course of them. There's been a whole series of bitter articles in the British media, especially, making this point. One it's not an article, it's a podcast by the former British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, which has appeared in the Daily Telegraph. There's been an article in the Financial Times by Ben Hall, Donald Trump's Ukraine peace juggernaut careers onwards, lack of clarity over US security guarantees shows primacy of form over substance. And anyway, there's been a lot more like that. Perhaps the most bitter article altogether about the meetings in Washington in the British media is one that's been written by Raphael Burr in The Guardian. He talks about how the Ukrainian and European leaders, especially the European leaders, basically cast their dignity away as they grovelled before Donald Trump. And he contrasted this with a completely different kind of reception that President Putin of Russia received when he met with Trump in Anchorage. And the point that Raphael Burr makes is that whilst Putin treats Trump as a protege, I would not go that far. I would say as an equal, and is treated by Trump with equivalent respect. The Europeans come across as undignified supplicants whenever they meet with Trump, and are treated by Trump with the contempt that kind of a status merits. And he also said, and Raphael Burr also makes the point, that not only does Trump seem much more relaxed and confident when he's talking to Putin, but one always gets the sense that ultimately he feels that his discussions with Putin are meaningful, whereas the Europeans have to strain and grovel and behave in the most undignified way in order to get any kind of apparent concession from Trump at all. Anyway, the general consensus in Britain, and by the way, not just Britain, but across Europe, is that the only real benefit of the meeting for the Europeans is that it didn't go badly wrong, that Trump had summoned Zelinski to Washington, but in the event, and perhaps because the Europeans were there, he didn't browbeat Zelinski as he perhaps might have been expected to do, and that there was no blow-up like the one that there was when Zelinski went by himself and met Trump in the Oval Office back in February. So this apparently was the achievement to prevent a collapse, an angry collapse of the discussions between Zelinski and Trump. That was the only thing substantively that the Europeans achieved. Now, of course, there have been other things that have been talked about. There's a lot of discussion now about the security guarantees. Trump, by the way, has been quietly taking further steps to row back on the whole topic of the security guarantees. I mentioned in my program yesterday that Donald Trump's Truth Social post, published after the meeting in Washington, and after Trump's conversation with Putin, basically dropped the idea of the United States giving Ukraine security guarantees. The only security guarantees that Trump apparently envisages will be provided by the Europeans. Then Trump spoke to Mark Levin, the US journalist, a notable hardliner on pretty much everything, by the way, and a person who, in my opinion, played a very sinister role in the lead up to the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, which of course also brought in the United States. But Trump, for whatever reason, appears to believe that Mark Levin is a person he needs to stay on the good side of. Anyway, Levin seems to have pressed Trump. Well, in fact, he did press Trump to a certain degree over the course of this interview. I noticed that Trump, again, did not commit the United States to providing security guarantees. Trump made it absolutely clear to Mark Levin that there would be no US troops actually deployed on Ukrainian territory at all. But he did say various things about how the United States might be prepared to provide help to the Europeans who would be providing the security guarantees and who might be deploying troops to Ukraine. And he spoke, as he often does, grandly about the United States providing capabilities or resources in the air which no one else apparently can offer. This is very, very typical Trump. And again, the following response was also typical, because in the hours that followed, the Europeans, desperate to show that they've come back with something from Washington, the Europeans and the European media floated the idea that the United States would be providing air support to the European forces that were stationed in Ukraine, assuming, of course, that the European forces are ever stationed in Ukraine. Anyway, I think this is reading far too much into Donald Trump's words. It's absolutely typical of Trump, in fact. He makes what look like commitments. I mean, like he was talking about security guarantees earlier last week. He seemed to have fallen into the trap of talking about security guarantees during his conversation with Merz and Zelinski and the other European leaders, the video conference that took place on Wednesday of last week ahead of the Alaska summit. As I said, he then wrote it back. He made it clear following the Washington meeting that the United States is not actually giving security guarantees. And then, of course, the Europeans come back and they say, well, what is the coordination that the president is now talking about? What does that mean? And, well, he now says it doesn't mean troops on the ground, but the United States is going to provide some sort of nebulous assistance, but it will all be in the air. I would say that it is all basically hot air. And I don't think anybody should take this especially seriously. The article that I discussed in the Financial Times by Ben Hall appears to have grasped this point. There isn't here anything real. There is no real discussion about the United States giving security guarantees. And I don't think the United States, or at least Donald Trump, is in the business of providing either the Ukrainians or indeed the Europeans security guarantees or backstops or anything like that. But anyway, there's been further talk about a tripartite or trilateral summit meeting between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, or even a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky. Agence France Presse, the French news agency, has been talking about a meeting in Moscow that Putin supposedly has invited Zelensky to Moscow. The Ukrainians, of course, have said that isn't possible. And to be frank, I don't believe that the Russians have in fact invited Zelensky to Moscow. I think that is a nonsensical claim. There's been reports about how there would be some kind of meeting in Rome, that Meloni has proposed Rome as another meeting place between Putin and Trump and Zelensky. The Russians have made it clear through the news agency TASS, the official news agency TASS, that a meeting in Rome is completely out of the question. And there's also reports that President Macron of France is now trying to talk up the idea of Geneva as a venue for a meeting, and that the Swiss authorities are supposedly giving the Russians assurances that if Putin does attend a meeting in Geneva, the Swiss will not try to enforce the ICC warrant by arresting him there. Supposedly, if Putin goes to Switzerland in his capacity as some kind of head of state on some kind of actual political mission, he cannot be arrested. But if he goes in some other capacity, I'm not sure which kind of capacity, well, then he can be arrested. I have to say, I find all of this completely ridiculous, and I don't myself believe that there is any possibility of a meeting taking place in Switzerland at all. The Russians have, in rejecting the proposal for a Rome summit, made it clear that they consider Rome to be the capital of an unfriendly country, which is Italy. And I get the sense that the Russians also, in fact, I understand that the Russians also consider Switzerland to be an unfriendly country as well. And they too do not believe that a meeting in Switzerland makes any sense. If there is ever going to be a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and a trilateral meeting between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump, I remain of the view that the strong Russian preference will continue to be to have it in Istanbul, where it will fall seamlessly, it will continue seamlessly as part of the ongoing negotiations, the direct negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which have already been taking place there. And again, to reiterate the point that I made in my program yesterday, the Putin's foreign policy aide, Ushakov, has already made it clear that if there is going to be a meeting, a further meeting at a higher level, it's going to be a meeting at a higher level by the Russian and Ukrainian delegations that have been meeting in Istanbul. That the status of those delegations, the status of the chief negotiators, might be upgraded. It could be upgraded up to the level of leaders, Putin and Zelensky. But so far, the Russians have only said that they're prepared to discuss this. They're not yet saying that they have agreed to it. Now, all of this is very interesting. Rubio is supposedly chairing meetings with the Europeans to discuss the security guarantees that the Europeans will be giving to the Ukrainians. This is the coordination the Americans are going to engage in. The White House has now, however, said that Catherine Levitt, the White House spokesman, has now confirmed that the security guarantees will have to be discussed with Russia. And as I've discussed in many programs, given that the Europeans and the Americans don't want to fight Russia, as they have shown through 3.5 years of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the terms of the security guarantees must be negotiated with the Russians, who hold an effective veto over the entire idea. So, as I said, this is all, as I said, at the moment, so much hot air, at least smoke and mirrors, maybe more than hot air, but smoke and mirrors. It has no substance at the moment. It is, again, the Western powers doing what Eve Smith talked about in that article she wrote on naked capitalism all that time ago, negotiating with each other about security guarantees, the details of which, when they come to an agreement, the Russians are likely to reject. Anyway, and the trilateral summit idea, the Putin-Zelensky summit idea, well, it was floated by Trump during the Washington meeting, but we've heard nothing further substantive about it since then. And incidentally, I've noticed that all of the talk about Ukraine pulling out of Donbass, ceasefires, all of that has basically, we've basically seen a stop of all those discussions too. Let me repeat again my own view that the only real topic that was discussed in Alaska between the Americans and the Russians, and probably the main topic of discussion between the Americans and the Russians in the various back-channel meetings that Rubio and Lukashenko have disclosed preceded the Alaska summit. The discussions that the Americans and the Russians have had was about whether or not to proceed to a ceasefire or whether or not to proceed to substantive negotiations with a view to achieving a comprehensive settlement of the entire conflict. The Americans at some point agreed that they would drop the demand for a ceasefire and that they would agree to the Russian position, that there should be negotiations leading to a comprehensive settlement of the entire conflict. The moment that happened, and the moment this was communicated to the Russians by Witkoff over the course of his visit to Moscow, 10 days ago, the moment that happened, the Russians agreed to the summit meeting between Putin and Trump. When the meeting in Alaska took place, Trump confirmed to Putin that the Americans had come round to the Russian point of view on this question. That explains why the meeting lasted all of 3 hours, but Putin had the confirmation from Donald Trump himself, which is important. That was the business of the summit. That was what the two leaders agreed. That is the understanding or agreement that Putin was referring to in the press conference. And everything else that we have heard about since then, the talk about land swaps, withdrawals, security guarantees, all of that is essentially just noise. The Americans have retreated from their demand for a ceasefire, and as they tend to do, and this is by no means unique to this administration, they have covered that retreat. They have hidden that retreat by making an immense amount of noise. And of course, the result is that we have ended up hearing an awful lot about withdrawals from Donbass, about possible ceasefires, about security guarantees, and about all of those things. But none of it is real. And as I said, it is taking our attention away from the one substantive concession which we know about, which was the American agreement that we should move forward to substantive negotiations rather than insisting first upon a ceasefire and, in effect, running the risk for the Russians that the conflict might be frozen, which is what the Trump administration was originally seeking. This is a substantive and important concession, more important, I think, than is widely understood. It means that the United States, that the President of the United States, has now dropped the Kellogg plan, that Kellogg's approach to the conflict has in effect been abandoned. And it also means, by the way, that the various American threats to impose massive sanctions and tariffs on the Russians and on their trading partners have been abandoned as well, at least for the time being, because they were all connected. All of those threats were connected to getting the Russians to agree to a ceasefire. Now, that brings me back to what happened in Washington. Merz and Macron continued to talk about ceasefires, as by the way did Zelinski. And Zelinski, Merz and Macron continued to demand sanctions and tariffs. But the President of the United States was unresponsive. Now, I think that the one commentator who has understood this and who has summed it up best is Thomas Farsi. He's written a fine article about all of this on Unheard. In fact, I would strongly urge people to read this article in its entirety. Its title is Trump's Ukraine Endgame. An American retreat will be disguised as peace. Thomas Farsi, has provided a useful summary of the article on his Substack blog. If you want to read the summary there, you can do so, but I would actually urge you to read the entire article because it is very interesting. And the article says that a comprehensive, the Substack piece, the Substack summary, also makes certain points about the overall American position, which is elaborated in more detail in the article in Unheard, which is that the Americans are retreating in Ukraine. Donald Trump, in a sense, is retreating over the conflict in Ukraine. But this is not because the United States has suddenly become converted to a policy of peace. It is because the realities of the conflict in Ukraine and the wider geopolitical and economic realities are obliging the United States to conduct that retreat. The United States, Donald Trump personally, continue to remain committed to maintaining their position of global primacy. And this inevitably is going to interfere in the ongoing attempts by the Americans and the Russians to establish a successful détente between them and to agree to a resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. This is what Thomas Fazzi says in his Substack piece. A comprehensive political settlement to the Ukraine war continues to remain elusive, not only because Europe and Zelensky remain opposed to any deal on Russian terms, the only possible terms given that Russia is winning the war, more fundamentally, because achieving lasting peace is about much more than just recognizing Russia's control over Crimea and the 4 oblasts. It's about addressing the primary roots of the conflict, as Putin repeated in Anchorage, that Ukraine will never join NATO, that the West will not transform it into a de facto military outpost on Russia's border, and that a broader balance of security in Europe be restored. This effectively amounts to a wholesale reconfiguration of the global security order, one that would reduce NATO's role, end US supremacy, and acknowledge a multipolar world in which other powers can rise without Western interference. This is something Trump, and more fundamentally, the US establishment, which operates largely independently of whoever occupies the White House, cannot concede. And I agree completely with this. It's a point that ultimately needs to be understood. Whatever tactical retreats the United States is being forced to make in Ukraine, it has not abandoned its overall strategic goals, which is to maintain US primacy. There might be a period of détente between Russia and the United States. Thomas Fazzi, both in the article in Unheard and in his Substack blog, mentioned this fact. But the United States' continuing strategic objectives will in the end make it all but impossible for this to evolve into a deeper friendship and peace. Anyway, let's move on, because as I said, I've gone into some lengths to discuss, as I said, what happened in Washington, and I've of course discussed what actually happened in Alaska now in great detail. There is one further point that I do want to make. Firstly, I've already discussed in various programs that something that we have been saying on the Duran for 3.5 years, that the main battle of the Ukrainian war is in Donbass and is being fought there, that the capture of Donbass by the Russian military will be decisive in shaping the entire outcome of the war, that there is no other territory in Ukraine that can replicate the unique geography of Donbass, the built-up areas, the line of fortified cities, the natural defense barrier that Donbass constitutes, and that once the Russians do capture Donbass, they will have gained operational space, and that following the fall of Donbass, the rest of Ukraine will be deeply vulnerable to any future Russian advances. To repeat, that is a point that we've been making on the Iran for 3.5 years, that I made extensively in programs that I did at the start of the conflict in February and March 2022, and I've made more recently since. And it's a point, by the way, that others have made as well. Stanislav Kaprivnik, for example, who, by the way, unlike me, has actually been to Donbass and is familiar with the geography there, and who is, of course, himself a former member of the US military, has made the point too. Anyway, it's fascinating to see how suddenly this observation, which has been denied or ignored for years, suddenly, now that the possibility of a Ukrainian retreat from Donbass, an agreed Ukrainian defeat from Donbass, has been floated, suddenly not just the Institute for the Study of War, but the Western media, after 3.5 years, that they have suddenly discovered it. I've been reading article after article about how Donbass, the cities, the towns in Donbass, are supposedly an impregnable fortress. They're not impregnable, on the contrary, as we will see later in the programme. We are now within measurable distance of the time when this fortress is going to fall. There is no such thing as an impregnable fortress. But anyway, I've been reading article after article in place after place that finally acknowledges this fact. And it does make me wonder whether some of the people who write these articles have known about this all along and have been, well, pretending not to discuss and talk about it, because of course it's not something that really lived up to the narrative or was consistent with the narratives about Ukrainian victories and stalemates and the war and bumbling Russian forces that we've been hearing so much about over the last 3.5 years. Anyway, that's one thing. The other thing is that suddenly, on the topic of the security guarantees, the whole topic of security guarantees, I've suddenly also read article after article which concedes, admits that the Russians and the Ukrainians did agree to security guarantees for Ukraine in the Istanbul Agreement, the draft Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, which the Ukrainians appear to have agreed to in principle, in fact did agree to in principle, and which they initialed, and the details of which were triumphantly reported by Ukrainian spokesmen, including, from memory, Mikhailo Podolyak, in interviews they gave to the Financial Times precisely at that time. Now, I say all of this because for years, the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022 was a topic that was entirely taboo across the media in the West. It was barely mentioned or referenced at all. You get occasional commentaries about this. You had efforts, major efforts, by people like the German diplomat Michael von der Schulenburg and the German general, General Kuyat. They did a detailed discussion, both of the Istanbul Agreement itself and of the lead up to how it was negotiated. It still remains by far the best discussion. That their report remains by far the best discussion of the whole topic. But anyway, this agreement, which for years was taboo, was not talked about at all, suddenly I've been reading article after article across the media by people who not only acknowledge the existence of the Istanbul Agreement, but suddenly seem to show great familiarity with its terms. In fact, they are now bringing up the topic of the particular clause in the Istanbul Agreement that provided for security guarantees for Ukraine, and they mentioned the fact that the security guarantees that were agreed at that time included Russia as a guarantor state, and that it provided the guarantees, provided the Russians with authority to veto deployment of foreign forces and the establishment of foreign bases on Ukrainian territory. Suddenly, as I said, people who have avoided all discussion of the Istanbul Agreement suddenly not only turn out to know all about it, but to know also the details, the minutiae of its terms. And of course, the reason they're bringing this all up now is because they want to make absolutely clear that any security guarantees that are similar to the ones that were set out in the Istanbul Agreement are, of course, unacceptable. They have to be security guarantees given exclusively by the Western powers. Russia, of course, cannot give security guarantees to Ukraine, nor can China, apparently. These countries cannot give security guarantees to Ukraine, and the security guarantees to Ukraine must be Article 5 type guarantees. They cannot be the kind of guarantees that Ukraine agreed to in the Istanbul Agreement back in April 2022. Again, I have to say that all this sudden erudition about the contents of the Istanbul Agreement do make me wonder whether some of the people who are now writing about the Istanbul Agreement in this erudite way have known about it all along. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this. It's a sore point with me to see, as I said, topics that I've been returning to again and again, and which I've always believed to be extremely important. The realities of the military geography of Donbass and the details of the Istanbul Agreement to be suddenly acknowledged by people in the media who gave the impression previously that they knew nothing about them. Anyway, let's move on, because if there's been an extraordinary lack of clarity and a lot of confusion and contradiction from the Western powers, from the United States, the administration, the Europeans, about what was discussed in Anchorage and in Washington, D.C., we now have a very, very clear discussion of this whole issue in an interview that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave to the Russian media. Now, I touched on this interview in my program yesterday, but the Russian Foreign Ministry has finally provided a detailed, a full transcript of the interview. I should say that Lavrov begins the interview rather humorously by bringing up the whole topic of his USSR T-shirt has now been brought up, is now brought up, and Lavrov, of course, denies that it was any type of trolling or anything of that kind. You can almost see his tongue still in his cheek as he talks about all of that. But then he goes into the substance of what was discussed in Alaska. And bear in mind that the summit in Alaska lasted just 3 hours. And I said The reason why it only lasted 3 hours is because the Americans had already conceded the substantive point before the discussion took place, which is that there would be no continued further American demand for a ceasefire. The Americans had come round to the Russian position that there must be a negotiated resolution of the conflict leading to a comprehensive peace. Anyway, Lavrov now discusses this. He says, first of all, that the mood was good. It was quite good. Not wonderful, but quite good. And it was a useful conversation. And then he goes on to say this. It showed without any doubt, first, that the US leader and his team are sincere in their commitment to achieve tangible results by bringing about something lasting, durable, and sustainable. In other words, a complete peace. This is what sets them apart from the Europeans, who at the time shouted at every corner that they would not accept anything but a ceasefire while continuing to supply weapons to Ukraine even after it is declared. So the Russians, ceasefire over. Trump accepts that there has to be a durable peace, and that is the only way forward. And then Lavrov goes on to say this. Secondly, Trump and his team have developed a clear understanding of the fact that this conflict has its causes, which means that all the speculation alleging that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked, all this is just baby talk. I cannot find any other way to frame this. What matters here is that they're still sticking in Europe to this narrative. Notice again the use of the word narrative. Their meeting with Trump, that's the Europeans, in Washington, where they summoned Zelinski, demonstrated that they continue to demand a ceasefire. At least some of the leaders, for example, Merz, are still talking about the need to pressure Russia with sanctions. And then Lavrov goes on and he gets to some of the more substantive issues. He says that they never talk about the human rights of Russians in Ukraine, that they continue to talk about Zelenski as being the main decider. He says that they also talk about deploying a peacekeeping force of some sort, which means sending a military force disguised as peacekeepers. And this means, in effect, propping up a man, and he uses the word man to describe Zelenski, who violates human rights. And how can that be justified? And how can that be acceptable? And he then continues by saying that all of this, of course, violates the Charter, the UN Charter, and then he goes on and discusses the root causes. And he says one such root cause lies in Russia's security concerns. These arise from the decades-long systematic violation of commitments made to us against NATO's eastward expansion. President Putin has repeatedly acknowledged that subsequent to these assurances, the alliance underwent 5 waves of expansion. To suggest that these were merely verbal promises is categorically false. Now, on this topic, I should say that Pascal Lotas at Neutrality Studies has undertaken an extraordinary amount of research on this topic, and he's pointed out that in the early 1970s, the International Court of Justice looked at this whole topic of verbal assurances and whether they carry any weight under international law, and he discovered that a decision of the International Court of Justice from the early 1970s an actual case, so this is substantive law, says quite clearly that verbal assurances of the kind that NATO made, at the Western powers made, at the end of the Cold War, not to expand NATO eastwards, that those sort of verbal assurances carry exactly the same weight in international law as written assurances do. And that is a decision of the International Court of Justice. It seems to me that this actually settles this topic conclusively, and you do not, in fact, need something in writing to make the kind of assurance that the Russians were repeatedly given. You don't need to formalize it in a written document to make it binding in international law terms. As I said, Pascal Lotaz and his team have researched this, and I have no reason to disagree with their conclusions, which seem to me entirely well-founded and absolutely spot on. But Lavrov then goes on to say this: these assurances were formalized in writing through political declarations signed at the highest level during the OSCE summits in Istanbul in 1999 and Astana 2010, which explicitly state that security is indivisible and no one may strengthen their own security at the expense of others. NATO did precisely that. No state or organization has the right to assert dominance over the OSCE space, yet they acted in direct contravention. To claim otherwise is mendacious, not least because a verbal promise carries weight, and crucially, that's the point that Pascal Lotaz makes, and crucially, there exists not only document evidence of these facts, but also highest level signed documents. The Russians have clearly researched this thoroughly, and in the event that there is ever a substantive discussion of this topic again, of the kind that the Russians tried to undertake in December 2021 when they proposed the two draft treaties, we can be sure that they will be bringing all of this up in detail then. And he then goes on to say that the US administration is generally committed to a settlement not to rearm Ukraine for war as occurred after the Minsk agreements, notice this, but to ensure this crisis never recurs, guaranteeing the lawful rights of all states in this region and the peoples inhabiting them. Now, this points to a much more detailed discussion of the underlying realities between the Americans and the Russians that we've had any reason to think has been taking place up to now. Because bear in mind that this is what Lavrov was talking about, and it's inconceivable that the discussions, the conversations between the Americans and the Russians in Alaska could have been as broad-ranging as this about NATO's expansion, about the various treaties and provisions, about the verbal assurances, about arming Ukraine after the Minsk agreements, as Lavrov is suggesting. The only explanation I can come up with is that all of this has been discussed at some length in the private discussions between the Americans and the Russians, which clearly have been taking place. And then Lavrov goes on to say this understanding, the understanding between the Americans and the Russians, in other words, about root causes, about NATO expansion, about arming Ukraine, about turning Ukraine into a military force, a military base threatening Russia. This understanding was reaffirmed during President's late night call with President Trump yesterday. This is the call that took place whilst the Washington discussions between Trump and Zelinski and the Europeans was still underway, in which the latter briefed our leader on his discussions with Zelinski and this so-called European support group. So, according to Lavrov, Trump not only told Putin that we're sticking by our position in Alaska, that we're going to go for an overall settlement, we are not going to go for a ceasefire, despite what the Europeans and the Ukrainians are saying. But supposedly, again, this is according to Lavrov, Trump reaffirmed the understanding. Remember that word understanding, because as I pointed out, the word that was used by Putin over the course of his press conference in Alaska was not that he'd reached agreements with Trump, but that he'd reached understandings with Trump. And it looks as if, judging from Lavrov's words, these agreements, or rather understandings, went beyond the idea of dropping the whole ceasefire proposal, but rather looking at a holistic agreement, which would mean that Ukraine would no longer represent a threat to Russia, would not be armed for war as occurred after the Minsk agreements, which is what Lavrov is talking about, but which would bring us to a position consistent with international law, consistent with the assurances the Russians were given at the end of the Cold War about the end of NATO's eastward expansion, and which Lavrov and the Russians have decided were internationally binding. Anyway, according to Lavrov, over the course of this conversation, during the Washington meeting, Trump apparently went out of his way to reassure Putin, or at least this is how I read Lavrov's words, that the understandings they had reached between them on all these wider topics were still in place. In other words, Trump was basically telling Putin, look, just ignore all the noise about security guarantees, about all of that, man swaps, all of that. It's all noise. What we actually came to an understanding about in Alaska, that remains real. Now that's what Lavrov, it seems to me, is saying. Now, whether this is true or whether the Russians are engaging in some degree of wishful thinking here, and whether perhaps they're over-interpreting what Trump meant during his meeting with Putin and what the Americans have been saying, I am not sure. I don't know. But to understand where this is going, this process is going, it is at least important to understand what the Russians see as coming out of the meeting in Anchorage and of the discussions which preceded it. They are seeing not just a resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, they are seeing also general movement towards a resolution, an end to the process of NATO expansion and NATO militarization, on the borders with Russia. And then Lavrov went into all the details that I discussed in my program yesterday about how, when speaking about Ukraine itself, it never really started as a territorial issue. It was all about the incredibly discriminatory and indeed cruel policies, according to the Russians, that the Ukrainians showed towards the Russian and Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, and how obviously all of that must be addressed. And, well, Lavrov, I should say, ridicules basically proposals about European deployments in Ukraine. I mean, he makes it quite clear that this is still unacceptable to the Russians. He says this is a military force disguised as a peacekeeping force. And then he says some really very interesting things about Ukraine. He says that Ukraine achieved independence from the Soviet Union by committing itself to remain neutral. We all know how all of these declarations about neutrality later incorporated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which ultimately became part of an independent Ukraine, that it all ended up as part of that independent state through the 1990 Declaration of State Sovereignty, adopted by the Kiev leadership. That document stated that Ukraine would forever remain a non-nuclear, neutral and non-aligned state. This was the commitment that formed the foundational basis for which Ukraine achieved its subsequent international recognition as an independent state. When he means international recognition, he means recognition as an independent state by first the Soviet Union and then by Russia. If Vladimir Zelinski's regime now rejects these commitments by discussing nuclear weapons, pursuing NATO membership, and rejecting neutrality, then it logically follows that these provisions, that very foundational basis for Ukraine's independent statehood, ceases to exist. This is a crucial point that must be considered. Otherwise, we are left with a situation where international law is not front and center. What Lavrov is saying is that Russia recognized Ukraine's independence on the basis that Ukraine would remain neutral, would remain non-aligned, would not seek nuclear weapons, and would not be a threat to Russia. If Ukraine persists in ignoring all of that, it rejects Trump's attempts and Russia's attempts to settle the conflict on the basis that Ukraine does become neutral, independent, non-aligned, non-nuclear, and of course continues to recognize all the other provisions in its constitution which safeguard the rights of Russians and Russian speakers on its territory, then the very foundation of Ukraine's independence, the basis upon which Russia recognized Ukraine's independence, will have gone. And Russia at that time, logically, this is not what Lavrov says, but that seems to me the logic of this. Russia at that point would be within its rights if it were to choose to decide that Ukraine cannot continue to be a fully independent state any longer. Now, just take pause and think of the implications of that. We've had all sorts of people in the media now acknowledge that the Donbass is Ukraine's fortress, its great line of defense, that if Ukraine loses Donbass, then the Russians can break through. And, well, nobody's saying that Ukraine will immediately collapse if Donbass falls. There would still no doubt be years of hard fighting still to go. But Western commentary is now acknowledging that with the fall of Donbass, Ukraine's ability to defend itself would be perhaps fatally compromised. And as we will see, the reality is that Donbass is indeed soon likely to fall. Given that this is so, and given what Lavrov is saying here, that the stakes involved are Ukraine's future survival, unless the Americans and the Russians can find some way to bring Ukraine back to its proper position as a neutral, independent, non-aligned state, which not only doesn't threaten Russia, but protects the rights of the Russian-speaking community within Ukraine, Ukraine itself might have forfeited the basis upon which it gained independence. Well, it looks as if what is now at stake is Ukraine's entire independence, survival as an independent state. Now, maybe Lavrov is overstating things in this interview, but can we completely disregard this? Again, I am not sure whether Donald Trump and the Americans really have made the concessions to the Russians that Lavrov seems to think that they have. Whether they really have accepted that the whole cause of the crisis was NATO's eastward expansion, that what needs to happen is to basically put the clock back to 1991, or maybe more accurately 1998, when NATO expansion, NATO's eastward expansion, started to happen in earnest, and to return to the understandings that were reached basically between Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War. I'm not sure that the Americans are anywhere close to understanding or conceding to any of that. But the Russians, Lavrov is saying that the Americans have, and it is on that basis that the conflict in Ukraine must be settled. Obviously, there are the territorial issues to take in mind, but there are the broader security issues as well. Ukraine's underlying position as a neutral, non-aligned, denuclearized state, one that doesn't threaten Russia. And again, reading these words of Lavrov in detail, it's abundantly clear that such a Ukraine as the Russians expect to see at the end of this process will be a Ukraine without Vladimir Zelensky. That man, the man, as Lavrov calls him, clearly, without a fundamental change in the political system in Ukraine, it is impossible to see how any of these things that Lavrov is talking about can happen. So bear in mind that Lavrov was there He was sitting alongside Putin during the meeting in Alaska. Ushakov was there too. We can get a sense from this interview of what the Russians think they have agreed with the Americans. It seems to me that the Russian understanding is completely at odds with the European understanding. Trump perhaps has some sense that the Europeans are hearing one thing and the Russians are hearing something completely different. It looks a little bit, I have to say, as if the reason Trump cut off in midstream his meeting with the Europeans was because he needed to reassure the Russians that in fact it was what he agreed with them in Alaska that was real. The Russians for the moment believe that. Notice how Lavrov talks about Trump's sincerity. Putin has talked in the same way, so has Ushakov. All I can say is, though, that if it is otherwise, and if what Trump is really trying to do is to try to split the difference, then the Russians will not be pleased. And putting aside whatever deals are eventually done between Russia and the United States to bring the conflict in Ukraine itself to an end, well, if, as I said, they feel that they're being cheated by Trump about all of these matters, then, as I said, the relationship between Russia and the United States will become, in my opinion, colder than ever. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. This is the nature of the discussion. As I said, the Russians are being told one thing. The Europeans have been told something completely different. The Europeans have been told all kinds of fairy tales about security guarantees, about deployments of forces. The Russians, who have a veto over all of these things, are rejecting all of that. The Russians have clearly their own ideas about Ukraine. They're going to stick with Istanbul Plus. I see nothing to suggest that the Russians have retreated from any part of Istanbul Plus. The Americans may be talking about freezes of the front lines in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, but I've seen nothing about that from the Russians. And the Russians have even wider plans for a reconstruction of the security architecture in Europe. And they think that the Trump administration is interested in moving forward with all of this with them. My own view is the same as Thomas Farsi's. I don't believe, ultimately, that that will happen. Anyway, I thought I would discuss this at length. Let me now talk about the military situation, because, of course, it is the military situation that continues to drive the war. Before I do, there's just one further point I wanted to make. Lavrov, prior to the Alaska summit, I mentioned that the presence in the Russian delegation of the finance minister, Anton Siluanov, seemed to me intended to produce for the Americans the person who would explain to the Americans why sanctions and tariffs against Russia would not work. Lavrov in this interview says that in fact sanctions weren't discussed at all. So it looks as if whatever Siluanov's the purpose of bringing Siluanov along might have been for the Russians, it turned out otherwise. I now suspect that what happened was that the Americans and the Russians came to an understandings between them much more quickly than either of them perhaps expected to, and that the Russians realized that the discussion about sanctions that they thought might be needed, that discussion never actually was needed after all, and for that reason it didn't happen. And that was why the meeting in Anchorage lasted only 3 hours and didn't last for the many more hours that many expected. Now let me turn to the military situation, which continues to drive events and which, by the way, remains as intense as ever. The Russians and the Ukrainians are now once again attacking each other's energy systems. There was a brief ceasefire a few months ago in which each side agreed not to attack the other side's energy systems. The Ukrainians basically disregarded that ceasefire and have resumed attacks on Russia's energy system in earnest. They recently attacked the Druzhba oil pipeline, which provides oil to Hungary, amongst other countries. The Russians repaired it quickly. The Hungarians have thanked them for that, but obviously it's put more strain between the Hungarians and the Ukrainians. And interestingly enough, the media in the West has acknowledged finally that the Ukrainians did indeed attack the Druzhba pipeline. The Russians have been systematically destroying more Ukrainian oil and oil refinery and energy facilities. And interestingly, whereas previously they appeared to be avoiding attacks on oil refineries and energy facilities that refined and transported oil and energy products from Azerbaijan, now they show no restraint in attacking them, which must be putting Azerbaijan itself under significant pressure. Just saying. This is a big topic to discuss on another day. The Russians launched a major attack on the Odessa region yesterday, but the situation on the front lines is perhaps what is most interesting. Now, before I discuss that, I want to make a comment about the various claims about casualties on each side that we've been hearing so much about recently. Now here, I'm going to disclose some information that I've received. I've been talking about casualties an awful lot recently on programs, and of course many people in the West talk about them incessantly, and of course Donald Trump has talked about casualties. I have obtained information about casualties, both Russian and Ukrainian casualties. And I should say that I am very familiar with the sources of this information. And I consider these sources to be, well, unimpeachable. I would also say that these sources are based on two samples, one Ukrainian, one Russian, samples of actual Ukrainian and Russian soldiers. And the samples, unlike the media zona samples, are of actual soldiers, the people who have been putting together these samples know the entire background of the soldiers in these samples. So we are talking about soldiers who are actual persons, their actual personalities. A great deal is known about them. And these samples have tracked, these are samples of soldiers whose involvement in the war has been tracked constantly ever since the start of the special military operation in February 2022. They are not all of them people who joined or who participated in the conflict from 2022. Some of them joined later, but from the moment that, but from various moments when they joined the armies, they have been tracked by the people who have been keeping an eye on these samples. So that gives you a sense of what we're talking about. Actual soldiers, people whose careers, if you like, in the Ukrainian and Russian armies have been tracked and followed from the moment that they became involved in those armies, in some cases going all the way back to February 2022, and whose outcomes, if I can put it like that, are known. So this is different from the media zona methodology, and it is actually extremely interesting, and it is producing rather different results. Now, here I would say something. We're not talking about enormous samples, but we're talking about samples of soldiers on each side that run into the hundreds, not the thousands, the hundreds. And I would also say that the Ukrainian sample is much bigger than the Russian one, so there might be some element of distortion. Well, the Russian sample is not small, just to say. Anyway, I've looked at these samples, and this is what I found. Out of the total Ukrainian sample, only 11% of the Ukrainian soldiers who formed the sample, some of them, as I said, joined the Ukrainian military back in February 2022. Some of whom joined the Ukrainian military later, but as I said, whose progress through the military has been followed. Only 11% of them are still in the army today. 81% of those who joined the Ukrainian military at the start of the special military operation, 81% are dead. Others who joined later, but who formed part of this sample, 77% of them are dead. There is a certain percentage who are exceptionally heavily wounded, which is why we're talking about 89% of the entire sample who are no longer in the military. But where you can work out the figures, 81% of the original contingent are dead, 77% of the later contingent are dead. A very, very high proportion of them have been very seriously wounded so that they're not able to fight and participate in the army anymore. Just 11% are in the military still. If we look at the Russian figures, they are completely different. 79% of Russian soldiers who have entered the military since the start of the special military operation are still serving. They're still there participating in the fighting. 21% have either been killed or so severely wounded that they're not able to fight anymore. Of that 21%, well, 3/4, 16% of the total were killed and 5% were severely wounded. So roughly 80% of the Russian soldiers are still there, still fighting. Only 11% of the Ukrainian soldiers who join up are. Now, obviously, these are samples. They might not be reflective of everything. And I believe these are combat soldiers, and I should make that clear. I suspect most of them, I'm going to guess here, I don't know exactly what role the soldiers actually play. The people who provided me with this information do know. But I'm not going to explore that further. Anyway, that gives you a sense, I think, of the level of casualties. And I suspect, as I said, that this is mostly true. Most of these people, I'm guessing, are infantry. 11% survivors on the Ukrainian side, just under 80% survivors on the Russian side. And notice, by the way, what a very, very high proportion of deaths there are. Roughly 80% losses, critical losses, irreplaceable losses, 75% or almost 80% of irreplaceable losses are actual deaths. That's true on both the Russian and on the Ukrainian side. Of course, I should say that many of the survivors, many of the people who are still fighting, have themselves been wounded lightly at various times, but they've been patched up and they've gone back into the battle. If these numbers are correct, and they are factually correct, as I said, it may be that if we're looking at the overall totals of Ukrainian and Russian losses, well, I mean, obviously, it's an inference on my part that they reflect the larger losses. But if we can extrapolate in that way about larger, from these samples, about larger, greater Russian and Ukrainian losses, then I'm going to say that the highest estimates of Ukrainian losses are probably true, and the lowest estimates of Russian losses are probably also true. Ukrainian losses would be on a scale comparable as a percentage of Ukraine's male population, would be comparable, I suspect, to the losses of the male population suffered by the Confederate States during the American Civil War. Anyway, I wanted to say that. I think this is important information. As I said, I'm not... there are qualifications about this data, but about the factual reality of this data, I have no doubt whatsoever. As I said, I know the sources, I know the methodologies that we used, and they are unimpeachable. Anyway, let's just talk about the military situation. Now, over the last couple of days, the Ukrainians have been claiming that the situation in Pokrovsk has been stabilized. I take the diametrically opposite view. In fact, more and more people who have been observing the conflict properly are coming round to the view that the Ukrainian counterattacks in the Pokrovsk area have actually failed. The Russians have continued their advances deeper into Rodinsk. They have apparently captured more of Mirnograd. They are also steadily advancing in the southwest and southeastern areas of Pokrovsk itself. The Ukrainians are unable, it seems to me, to deny the reality that their attempt to reverse the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk have been unsuccessful. So they recently taken to making claims about successful counterattacks inside Pokrovsk itself. They've supposedly driven the Russians back from the central areas of Pokrovsk. There is no video footage that I am aware of that confirms these Ukrainian claims. I would take all of this information with a mountain of salt. I am very skeptical about it. Just to say, I discussed a few days ago about how the Russians have apparently laid out the entire territory around Pokrovsk and Pokrovsk itself as a kind of killing fields or meat grinder in Pokrovsk, killing fields in terms of the fields north and west and east of Pokrovsk for the Ukrainian military. And I was provided that information by a private source emailing me, but we're getting more and more information from open sources that say that this is true. When I say open sources, I mean bloggers and reporting channels and that kind. The Ukrainians rushed reinforcements to contain the Russian breakthrough in Pokrovsk and to prevent a collapse in Pokrovsk. That has left entire brigade groups of the Ukrainian army apparently out in the open fields where they are targets for the Russian Air Force, which has been striking them with fab bombs and other weapons, and of course for the Russian Rubicon FPV drone operators and all of those people who are being massively busy in the fighting around Pokrovsk. So the Ukrainian units around Pokrovsk are being bled dry again. Aggressive attrition has continued to be the Russian tactic throughout the war, or at least since the summer of 2022, and we can see that it continues to be applied around Pokrovsk. And, well, there's been further news that the Russians have continued to advance in the areas to the east of the breakthrough area, that these villages, Kucherev Yar, Shahove, Volodymyrovka, that the Russians are gradually encircling this belt of villages and are likely to capture them, which will, as I've said already, if it's achieved, it will thicken out the Russian breakthrough area significantly. And, well, it seems to be that the Ukrainian crisis around Pokrovsk is actually continuing to worsen, perhaps less dramatically than was the case, appeared to be the case a couple of days ago. But whatever temporary stabilization has been achieved has been at appalling cost, and in a way that is creating a deeper crisis for the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk area. Meanwhile, the Russians have been taking advantage of the redeployment of Ukrainian troops from the Konstantinovka area to Pokrovsk. It seems that it's now acknowledged that the Russians have indeed broken into Konstantinovka itself. The fighting is now underway for that town. It looks as if the battle for Konstantinovka itself has begun. And there's further news about how the Russians have now broken Ukrainian defenses in the Siversk area, in the area of the Serebyanka forest, and of course they captured the village of Serebyanka a couple of days ago. They seem to be pushing both west and south from this territory that they've captured towards Siversk itself. And there's been more reports about how the Russians have indeed captured the village of Kolodisi and other villages close to Liman. And there's talk about an attack on Liman being only a short time away. Lastly, and this is the last thing I'm going to say today's program, there are reports that the Russians there's video footage provided by the Ukrainians which confirms the presence of Russian troops in the very center of Kupiansk itself. It looks as if the battle of Kupiansk, which is proving to be very fierce, is now reaching a critical point. To repeat again, yes, this line of cities in Donbass has indeed been a massive problem for the Russians. But the people who write about this in the media now, just as they previously refused to acknowledge the existence of this line of cities, are now refusing to acknowledge that this line is cracking and before long will break. What they will say when it does remains to be seen. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Tomorrow I do hope to discuss more developments in the drone war, where, as I said, there have been some interesting admissions on the Ukrainian side. But this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.